Her groom walked away mid-vows, right there in front of the whole town, church bell ringing, veil trembling, shame burning hotter than noon sun. But as whispers filled the pews and her tears hit the floorboards, the doors opened again. And in walked the man everyone feared to cross, the mountain hermit said to have killed with his bare hands. He didn't speak soft. He just looked her in the eye and said he'd stand in the groom's place. By sundown, she was riding beside a stranger through the cold mountain pass, his silence heavier than the snow around them. No one in town knew why he did it, or what secret he was running from. But when a slick rancher and a railroad man come for her land, the truth buried in that cabin could tear the mountains wide open. What made the most feared man in Colorado marry a broken bride before God and all creation? And when his past comes calling, will love be enough to save them both? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Ashley Winton's delicate fingers smoothed the handmade lace of her wedding gown, a creation she'd spent months perfecting. Each careful stitch had been a prayer, each pearl sewn with dreams of the future. Now she stood at the front of Silver Creek's white-steepled church, her heart thundering against her ribs as the morning sun streamed through tall windows, painting rainbow patterns across the wooden floor. The murmurs started as gentle as prairie grass in the wind. 10 minutes late, then 20. The assembled townsfolk shifted in their seats, the wooden pews creaking beneath their Sunday best. Ashley forced herself to breathe steady, though her throat felt tight as a drawn purse string. "Perhaps there's been a delay with the horses," Pastor Matthews whispered kindly. He'd been her father's closest friend, had baptized her in this very church 28 years ago. His weathered face showed concern beneath his silver hair. Another 5 minutes crawled past. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Ashley could make out fragments now, sharp as broken glass. "Always was above his raising. That water rights agreement? Poor thing." The church doors groaned open, and Ashley's heart leaped. But it was only Mrs. Henderson, perpetually late to every town gathering since 1872, shuffling to find a seat near the back. The momentary hope made the disappointment cut deeper. Ashley's fingers worried at the delicate lace sleeve she'd trimmed with tiny seed pearls. The bouquet of wild roses and prairie flowers trembled in her other hand. She'd gathered them herself at dawn, when the world still held promise. The clock above the door ticked relentlessly. 30 minutes late now. Ashley felt every eye in the church boring into her back. The white dress that had made her feel like a princess now seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, dragging her down into the earth. Finally, the doors opened again. Caden Weller stood in the doorway, his usual confident stance replaced by something unfamiliar. His face was pale as fresh milk, and his eyes, those eyes that had promised her the world, wouldn't meet hers. Ashley's heart stopped, then started again with painful force. He walked halfway up the aisle, his boots echoing against the floorboards in the dead silence. The sound reminded Ashley of the hammer falls at her father's funeral 2 years ago. When Caden spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but in the thick quiet, it carried to every corner of the church. "I can't." He swallowed hard, still not meeting her gaze. "I can't go through with this." The words hung in the air like smoke. Ashley stood frozen, her mind refusing to understand what her ears had heard. Caden took a step backward, then another. Then he turned and walked out, each footfall a death knell to her dreams. The church erupted in shocked whispers. Ashley heard someone gasp, "Well, I never!" Someone else clicked their tongue in that particular way that meant they'd seen it coming all along. The sound of rustling skirts and murmured conversations swelled like a wave, threatening to drown her. "My dear child," Pastor Matthews said softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. The sympathy in his voice nearly broke her. "Let me help you to the side room." But Ashley couldn't move. Her feet seemed rooted to the spot where she'd expected to begin her new life. Instead, she slowly sank down onto the altar steps, her white skirts pooling around her like fallen snow. The roses slipped from her numb fingers, scattering across the wooden steps. Through tears she refused to let fall, Ashley stared at the open church doors. Beyond them she could see a patch of blue sky and the dust Caden's horse had kicked up as he rode away. The same dust now coated her carefully polished shoes. Mrs. Peterson, who'd helped raise Ashley after her mother passed, pushed through the crowd. "Come away, child," she urged, her kind face creased with worry. "Don't let them see you cry." But Ashley wasn't crying. The pain was too deep for tears, a hollow ache that seemed to echo through her entire being. She could hear the townspeople's whispers growing bolder. "Always said he was too handsome by half. Thought herself above us with those fancy dresses she makes. Bound to end in heartbreak." Pastor Matthews raised his voice above the growing din. "Friends, please, this is still God's house. Show some Christian charity." But the damage was done. The sanctuary that had witnessed every important moment of Ashley's life, her baptism, her father's funeral, and now this, had become a theater for her humiliation. The morning light that had seemed so promising now felt harsh and exposing. Miss Abigail Turner, who'd never approved of Ashley's friendship with her nephew Thomas, spoke loud enough to ensure her words carried. "Well, what can you expect? Getting above herself with all those fancy stitches and cityfied ways. My Thomas always said, 'That's enough, Abigail.'" Pastor Matthews's voice carried the sharp edge of authority he rarely used. The woman fell silent, though her pinched expression spoke volumes. Ashley's hands found the cross her father had given her, hanging from a delicate chain around her neck. She clutched it like a lifeline, remembering his words. "The Lord gives us trials to test our mettle, child, like heating gold in a crucible." If this was a test, it felt like being burned alive. Mrs. Peterson tried again to coax her up. "Come on, dear, I'll take you home. We'll have some tea and—" "No." Ashley's voice surprised her with its steadiness. "No, I need a moment alone. Please." The older woman hesitated, clearly torn between respecting Ashley's wishes and protecting her from the cruel attention of the crowd. Pastor Matthews made the decision for her, raising his voice to address the congregation. "Friends, I believe it's time we gave Miss Winton some privacy. Please, make your way home. Remember that gossip helps no one and harms many." The crowd began to disperse, though reluctantly. Ashley could feel their stares, hear their whispered commentary. She kept her spine straight, her chin up, though it felt like trying to hold up the weight of the whole territory. Soon, only Pastor Matthews remained, standing quietly nearby like a watchful guardian. The church that had been full of anticipatory joy just an hour ago now felt vast and empty, the silence broken only by the steady tick of the clock and the distant call of meadowlarks. "He didn't even tell me why," Ashley whispered, more to herself than to the pastor. The words seemed to echo in the empty church. Pastor Matthews settled carefully beside her on the steps, his aging joints protesting. "Sometimes, child, the why matters less than what we do next." Ashley looked down at her hands, still clutching her father's cross. The sunlight caught the simple silver, making it shine. "What do I do next, Pastor? How do I walk out those doors and face everyone? How do I—" Her voice caught, but she forced herself to continue. "How do I go on?" The old pastor was quiet for a long moment, considering her questions with the weight they deserved. "You go on the same way you've faced every other trial, Ashley, one step at a time, with faith and dignity. Your worth isn't measured by Caden Weller's choices." A tear finally escaped, tracking down her cheek. Ashley brushed it away quickly. "I feel such a fool. All those months of planning, of dreaming, the water rights agreement we signed last week, was any of it real?" "The agreement?" Pastor Matthews's brow furrowed slightly. "Caden insisted we settle the water rights before the wedding. Said it would be easier to manage the combined properties that way." Ashley's voice turned bitter. "I suppose that should have been a sign." The pastor's expression darkened for a moment, but he kept his voice gentle. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, child. Sometimes what seems like our greatest trial becomes our greatest blessing." Ashley gathered her scattered flowers, their petals bruised but still fragrant. The sweet scent that had brought her such joy this morning now made her stomach turn. "I should go home. There's no point in staying here." "Let me fetch Mrs. Peterson to walk with you. The town gossips will be out in force." "No." Ashley stood, squaring her shoulders beneath the lace she'd crafted with such care. "I need to do this alone. Like you said, one step at a time." Pastor Matthews nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Remember, Ashley, you're not alone. The Lord is with you, and so are those who truly care for you." Ashley managed a small, brave smile. "Thank you, Pastor, for everything." She gathered her skirts and walked down the aisle, each step measured and deliberate. The empty church watched her pass, sunlight and shadows painting patterns on her white dress. At the doors, she paused, taking a deep breath of the morning air. Beyond the church steps lay Silver Creek, the only home she'd ever known, now transformed into a gauntlet she would have to walk. But Ashley Winton was her father's daughter, and she would walk it with her head held high, even if her heart was breaking with every step. The heavy oak door creaked open once more, and a shadow fell across the church floor. The remaining townsfolk fell silent, their whispers dying like leaves in winter. Jonas Creed filled the doorway, his broad frame casting long shadows in the afternoon light. The scar that ran from his left temple to jaw caught the sunlight, a pale reminder of whatever violence had marked him. People shrank away as he stepped inside, mothers pulling children closer, men averting their gazes. Jonas seemed not to notice, or perhaps he was simply used to it. His eyes, dark and steady beneath the brim of his hat, fixed on Ashley where she stood trembling by the altar. His boots made no sound on the wooden floor as he approached, surprising for such a large man. He stopped at the front pew, removing his hat with calloused hands that had known hard work and harder times. "Miss Winton," he said, his voice low and rough, like stone over stone. "If you're willing, I'll stand in Weller's place." A collective gasp rippled through the remaining congregation. Mrs. Peterson clutched her shawl tighter, while Thomas Turner's mother crossed herself, muttering under her breath. Ashley stared at Jonas, her tear-streaked face a mask of disbelief. She had seen him before, of course. Everyone in Silver Creek knew of Jonas Creed, the mountain man who lived in solitude up beyond Miller's Creek. He traded furs in town twice a year and spoke to almost no one. Some said he'd done terrible things during the war. Others whispered worse. Pastor Matthews cleared his throat, clearly uncertain. "Mr. Creed, while your offer is unexpected, I'm not sure this would be appropriate. Miss Winton has suffered a great shock and—" "Please." Ashley's whisper cut through the minister's protests. Her fingers twisted the lace of her skirts, knuckles white with tension. I'll have him." "Ashley, child," Mrs. Peterson stepped forward, her face lined with concern. "You don't know what you're saying. This isn't like you, making such a rash decision." But Ashley's eyes never left Jonas's face. There was something in his steady gaze that spoke of understanding, of knowing what it meant to stand alone while others whispered. "I know exactly what I'm saying." Jonas moved forward then, taking his place beside her at the altar. He stood straight-backed and solemn, like a man facing judgment. Perhaps, in some way, he was. Pastor Matthews looked between them, his weathered face troubled. "Are you certain about this, Ashley? There's no shame in—" "There's already shame," Ashley said quietly, her voice stronger now. "But there's also choice, and I choose this." The pastor nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. He opened his Bible again, the pages rustling in the hushed church. "Very well. Dearly beloved." The ceremony that followed was brief, stripped of the songs and readings that had been planned for Ashley's wedding to Caden. Just the essential words, the ancient promises spoken in voices that carried different weights of meaning. When it came time for the rings, Jonas reached into his vest pocket and produced a simple gold band. The sight of it caused another ripple of whispers. Why would a mountain man carry a wedding ring? But if he heard the speculation, he gave no sign. His hand, when he took Ashley's, was surprisingly gentle. The calluses on his palm were warm against her skin as he slipped the ring onto her finger. His own hands trembled slightly, though his face remained composed. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Pastor Matthews declared, his voice echoing in the near-empty church. "You may kiss your bride." Jonas hesitated, then leaned forward and pressed the briefest of kisses to Ashley's forehead. It was a gesture more blessing than passion, and somehow all the more touching for its restraint. Outside, the church bells began to toll again, their song uncertain now, as if the bells themselves were confused by this turn of events. The sound carried across Silver Creek, telling everyone who hadn't witnessed it that something momentous had occurred. The remaining townsfolk parted like water as Jonas and Ashley made their way down the aisle. No one threw rice or offered congratulations. Their faces showed everything from shock to disapproval to morbid fascination. The sky had begun to darken, heavy clouds gathering overhead like spectators to this strange drama. Ashley paused at the church steps, looking up at the threatening dusk. Jonas's hand settled lightly at her elbow. "My wagon's behind the church," he said quietly. "If you need to gather your things—" Ashley nodded, unable to speak. The reality of what she'd done was beginning to sink in. She would be leaving everything she knew, her small house with its neat garden, her dressmaking business, the town that had been her home for all of her 32 years. "I'll go with you," Mrs. Peterson announced, stepping forward. Her chin was set in a way that suggested she wouldn't take no for an answer. "To help you pack." Jonas nodded, stepping back to give them space. "I'll ready the wagon." The walk to Ashley's house was silent, save for the whisper of her wedding dress against the dusty street. News traveled fast in Silver Creek. Faces appeared in windows, curtains twitching aside just long enough for watching eyes to take in the spectacle of Ashley Winton in her bridal finery, walking home with Mrs. Peterson instead of riding in Caden Weller's fine carriage. Inside her small house, Ashley moved with mechanical precision, packing her trunk while Mrs. Peterson hovered anxiously nearby. "You don't have to do this," the older woman said for the third time. "You could stay here. People would understand if you changed your mind." Ashley carefully folded her best shawl, the one she'd embroidered with roses for special occasions. "No, they wouldn't understand at all. They'd whisper even more about how I'd been abandoned twice in one day. But to go with that man, Ashley, no one knows anything about him except that he fought in the war, and there are stories." "Stories," Ashley echoed, placing her father's Bible atop her clothes. "That's all they are. And I'd rather face the unknown than stay here and be the subject of everyone's stories." She changed out of her wedding dress, hanging it carefully in the wardrobe. In its place, she donned her sturdy traveling dress and warm shawl. The ring on her finger caught the lamplight as she moved, a strange weight she would have to get used to. Jonas was waiting with his wagon when they emerged. He stood beside it, patient as stone, while Ashley said goodbye to Mrs. Peterson. The older woman hugged her tight, tears flowing freely now. "If you need anything at all, you send word," Mrs. Peterson insisted. "Promise me." "I promise," Ashley whispered, hugging her back just as fiercely. Jonas stepped forward to load Ashley's trunk into the wagon. He handled it with care, securing it properly against the rough journey ahead. Then he turned and offered his hand to help Ashley up onto the seat. His palm was warm and steady against hers as she climbed up. Once she was settled, he took his place beside her and picked up the reins. The horses started forward at his gentle command, their hooves striking a steady rhythm on the packed earth. Ashley looked back as they started up the trail that would lead to Jonas's cabin in the mountains. The church steeple was still visible, white against the darkening sky. The bells had fallen silent now, their uncertain song replaced by the creak of wagon wheels and the soft snort of horses. She thought she could see Mrs. Peterson still standing in the street, a small figure growing smaller with each turn of the wheels. Beyond her, Silver Creek spread out like a familiar book whose pages she'd never read again. The air grew cooler as they climbed, carrying the scent of pine and approaching rain. Ashley pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, stealing a glance at the man beside her. Jonas kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his profile stern in the fading light. The scar on his face seemed deeper in the shadows, a mark of some story she didn't know. They were strangers who had just promised to share a life. Ashley wasn't sure whether to be terrified or grateful. Perhaps she was both. The wagon creaked onward, carrying them away from the town and its whispers toward whatever future lay waiting in the mountains above. Ashley touched the ring on her finger, feeling its unfamiliar weight. Behind them, the first drops of rain began to fall, washing away the dust of the road they'd traveled. The wagon wheels struck another rock, sending a jolt of pain through Ashley's side. She pressed her lips together, determined not to complain. The rough mountain trail seemed endless, winding higher and higher through stands of towering pines. Their branches stretched overhead like grasping fingers against the deepening twilight. Is it much further?" she ventured, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the past hour. Jonas gave a short nod, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The horses picked their way carefully, their breath visible in the cooling air. Ashley pulled her shawl tighter, wishing she'd thought to pack her heavier wool cloak. But then, she hadn't expected to be traveling into the mountains on her wedding night. Her wedding night. The thought made her stomach clench. She stole another glance at the stranger beside her, her husband now, though the word felt foreign in her mind. The scar that ran from his temple to jaw caught the fading light, a pale line against his weathered skin. His expression remained unreadable as he guided the wagon around another bend. They passed a half-frozen creek, its waters singing softly beneath a thin sheet of ice. Ashley's fingers had grown numb despite her tucking them into her shawl. The temperature dropped steadily as they climbed, until she could see her own breath mixing with that of the horses. "The creek marks the edge of my property," Jonas said suddenly, his deep voice startling after so much silence. It was only the third or fourth time he'd spoken since they'd left Silver Creek. Ashley nodded, unsure what response was expected. She wanted to ask how much land he owned, how long he'd lived here, what kind of life she could expect, but the question stuck in her throat. Instead, she watched as the first stars began to appear overhead, bright pinpricks in the darkening sky. The wagon rounded one final bend, and Ashley caught her first glimpse of her new home. The cabin sat in a clearing, sturdy logs silvered by weather and age. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, disappearing into the star-scattered sky. A barn stood off to one side, its door slightly ajar. Jonas drew the wagon to a halt near the cabin's front door. "Wait here," he said, climbing down. He disappeared into the barn with the lantern, leaving Ashley alone in the growing darkness. She sat very still, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night. An owl called somewhere in the distance. The wind sighed through the pines. It was so different from the familiar sounds of Silver Creek. No distant church bells, no neighbors' voices, no creak of the boardwalk under passing feet. Light spilled suddenly from the cabin's doorway as it swung open. Ashley caught a glimpse of movement inside. Someone small darting away from the door. Jonas emerged from the barn and lifted her trunk down from the wagon before offering his hand to help her descend. Her legs felt stiff from the long ride, and she stumbled slightly. Jonas's hand steadied her, then quickly withdrew. He carried her trunk to the cabin door, then stepped back to let her enter first. The cabin's interior was simple but tidy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows. A narrow bed stood in one corner, its quilt neat and folded. A table with 3 chairs occupied the center of the room, and Ashley noticed a few books stacked carefully on a crude shelf. Movement near the hearth drew her attention. A boy of about 10 years old peered out from behind the stone chimney, his dark eyes curious but wary. His features suggested native heritage. Perhaps Ute, Ashley thought, remembering the tribes that lived in these mountains. Jonas cleared his throat. "This is Toby," he said, his voice softening slightly. "I look after him." He hesitated, then added, "Toby, this is Miss Ashley. She'll be staying with us now." "Mrs. Creed," Ashley corrected quietly, the name still strange on her tongue. Toby emerged fully from behind the chimney, studying her with solemn eyes. "Did you make your dress?" he asked suddenly. Ashley looked down at her traveling dress, surprised by the question. "Yes, I did." A small smile flickered across the boy's face. "It's nice. The stitches are even, like beaver tracks in snow." The unexpected compliment brought tears to Ashley's eyes, though she blinked them back quickly. "Thank you, Toby." Jonas moved around the cabin, lighting a second lamp and adding wood to the fire. "You can take the bed," he said, not meeting her eyes. "I'll sleep outside in the barn." "But surely," Ashley began, then stopped at the set of his shoulders. "At least take some blankets. It's too cold to sleep without them." He nodded shortly and gathered a few blankets from a chest near the bed. "Toby can show you where everything is." He paused at the door. "There's bread and stew on the stove if you're hungry." Then he was gone, the door closing, behind him with a soft thud. Ashley stood in the middle of the cabin, suddenly uncertain what to do next. The events of the day felt like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. This morning she had dressed in her wedding gown, expected to become Mrs. Caden Weller. Now she stood in a mountain cabin as Mrs. Jonas Creed, with a husband who preferred to sleep in the barn rather than share space with her. "Are you hungry?" Toby asked, breaking into her thoughts. "I made the stew myself. Jonas showed me how." Ashley managed a smile. "Yes, thank you. I'd like that." The boy moved to the stove with surprising efficiency, ladling stew into a bowl and cutting thick slices of bread. He seemed pleased to have something to do, and Ashley wondered how long he had lived here with Jonas. The stew was simple but good, rich with vegetables and what tasted like rabbit meat. Toby sat across from her at the table, chin propped on his hands, watching her eat. "Jonas is a good man," he said suddenly, as if answering a question she hadn't asked. "He saved me when my mother died. The other settlers wanted to send me to an Indian school, but Jonas said no. He said I could stay here and learn both ways." Ashley set down her spoon, touched by the boy's loyalty. "Both ways?" Toby nodded. "The white man's way and my mother's people's way. Jonas says both have value." He grinned suddenly. "Though my mother's people are better at tracking deer." After the meal, Ashley insisted on washing the dishes despite Toby's protests that it was his job. The familiar task helped settle her nerves, giving her hands something useful to do. Toby showed her where things were stored: cooking utensils in the cupboard by the stove, extra blankets in the chest, soap and washing things in a basket near the door. "I sleep up there," he said, pointing to a small loft above the main room. "Jonas built it special for me, with a window so I can see the stars." Finally, there was nothing left to do but prepare for bed. Ashley changed into her nightgown behind a screen that Jonas had obviously placed there for her privacy. The cot near the fire was narrow, but comfortable enough, though she couldn't bring herself to take the bed as Jonas had offered. She lay awake long after Toby's breathing had grown steady in the loft above, listening to the mountain wind moan around the cabin's corners. The fire's light played across the rough-hewn logs, creating shadows that seemed to dance and whisper. Everything felt strange. The smells of pine smoke and leather, the crackle of the fire, the absolute darkness outside the windows. Shame and confusion warred in her mind as she remembered the events of the day. Caden's rejection still stung, a raw wound she couldn't yet examine too closely. But mixed with the hurt was an odd gratitude toward Jonas, who had saved her from complete humiliation. She didn't understand his motives. Why would a man feared by most of the town offer marriage to a woman he barely knew? The night grew colder, and Ashley pulled the blankets tighter around her shoulders. She thought of Jonas in the barn, wondered if he was warm enough despite the blankets he'd taken. Toby's words echoed in her mind. Jonas is a good man. Before dawn, she rose and stoked the fire back to life, feeding it small pieces of kindling until the flames caught. The familiar task helped quiet her troubled thoughts. As light began to seep through the cabin's windows, she heard movement in the barn, Jonas beginning his day. She straightened her shoulders and reached for her apron. Whatever this strange marriage was, whatever had brought them to this point, she would face it with the same quiet determination that had carried her through other trials. One day at a time, one task at a time, until she found her footing in this new life. The coffee pot bubbled on the stove as the sun crept over the mountain peaks. Ashley stood at the window, watching the light paint the frost-covered clearing in shades of gold. Behind her, Toby's footsteps sounded on the loft ladder as he descended to start his day. Soon Jonas would come in from the barn, and they would begin the dance of learning to live together. Three strangers bound by circumstance and choice, trying to make a family from the broken pieces of their lives. The morning light filtered through the cabin's weathered windows as Ashley surveyed her new home. Dust motes danced in the pale sunbeams, revealing layers of mountain grit on every surface. She tied her apron strings tighter and rolled up her sleeves, determined to make herself useful. The cupboards yielded meager supplies: a half sack of flour, some dried beans, salt pork, and a few wrinkled potatoes. In the root cellar beneath the floor, she found preserved vegetables and strips of dried venison. Not much, but enough to work with. The practical task of taking inventory helped quiet her troubled thoughts. Through the window, she watched Jonas methodically splitting logs. His powerful swings sent chips of wood flying, the axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Toby perched on a nearby stump, whittling something with a small knife. The boy's dark eyes darted between Jonas and Ashley, curious but still cautious. Ashley found a broom in the corner and began sweeping, working her way from the hearth outward. Dust and pine needles collected in drifts. She noticed small touches that spoke of care. Fresh kindling stacked neatly by the stove, a rack of drying herbs, carefully mended curtains. This wasn't just a bachelor's cabin. It was someone's attempt at a home. The morning passed in quiet industry. Ashley scrubbed the rough wooden floors until they gleamed. She beat dust from the rag rugs outside, her arms aching from the unfamiliar work. The physical labor helped keep her mind from wandering back to yesterday's humiliation at the church. By midday, she had organized the kitchen area and started a pot of beans simmering with salt pork. Thus, familiar tasks anchored her, giving purpose to hours that might otherwise have been spent in anxious thought. Through the window, she could still hear the steady thunk of Jonas's axe. "You don't have to do all that," Toby said suddenly from behind her, making her start. He had slipped in silently, Indian fashion. Ashley wiped her hands on her apron. "I want to help," she said simply. "This is my home now, too." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "Jonas usually lets me do the cooking," he said. "He says I'm good at it." "Then perhaps you can teach me your secrets," Ashley smiled. "Would you like to help me prepare supper?" Toby's face brightened. He showed her where they kept the venison and helped her choose vegetables from the root cellar. His small hands were surprisingly capable as he chopped carrots and potatoes. As they worked, Ashley noticed several wooden figures arranged on the shelf above the hearth, delicately carved animals and birds. "Did you make those?" she asked. "Yes." Toby ducked his head shyly. "Jonas taught me how to carve. He says it's good to keep your hands busy." "They're beautiful," Ashley said sincerely. "You have a real gift." The boy's smile lit up his whole face. He scampered to the shelf and brought down several pieces to show her. A leaping deer, a soaring eagle, a mother bear with cubs. Each one showed remarkable detail and care. Outside, the chopping had stopped. Jonas came in carrying an armload of split wood, which he stacked carefully by the stove. His eyes took in the cleaned cabin, but he said nothing. The sun had set by the time they sat down to supper. Lamplight cast warm shadows as Ashley ladled venison stew into 3 bowls. Steam rose in the cool air, carrying the rich scent of herbs and meat. "This looks good," Jonas said quietly, the first words he'd spoken to her since morning. Ashley ventured a question. "Have you lived here long?" 5 years. He concentrated on his bowl. "Since after the war." "You fought?" she asked carefully. Jonas's face tightened. "Union Scout. Don't like to talk about it." Ashley nodded, accepting his reticence. She turned to Toby instead. "Would you tell me more about your carvings? I especially liked the bear family." The boy launched enthusiastically into explaining his techniques, demonstrating with his hands how he shaped the wood. Jonas watched silently, but Ashley noticed his shoulders gradually relaxing as Toby talked. After the dishes were washed and put away, Ashley gathered her courage. "Thank you," she said softly to Jonas, "for what you did yesterday. It was very kind." He shook his head, not meeting her eyes. "Wasn't kindness, just doing what's right." He pushed back his chair abruptly and strode outside into the darkness. Ashley sighed and began preparing for bed. She spread her quilt on the cot near the fire, though Jonas had again insisted she take the bed. Toby climbed to his loft, and soon his quiet breathing filled the cabin. Kneeling beside her cot, Ashley clasped her hands and bowed her head. "Lord," she whispered, "grant me understanding. Help me find my place here. And thank you for sending these two lonely souls to shelter me when I had nowhere else to turn." The night grew still around her prayers. Through the window, she could see Jonas's shadow moving in the barn, a darker shape against the darkness. Morning came with frost painting delicate patterns on the window panes. Ashley rose early to stoke the fire and start breakfast. As she measured coffee into the pot, a sound drifted in from outside. Someone humming softly. She moved to the window. Jonas was mending the split-rail fence, working with careful concentration. The tune he hummed was familiar. Amazing Grace, the same hymn they'd sung in church last Sunday. Ashley's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. This man who spoke so little, who carried such obvious burdens, still held faith in his heart. The discovery felt like a tiny flame kindling in the darkness, a first fragile bridge across the gulf between them. Toby appeared at her elbow, also listening. "He sings sometimes when he thinks no one can hear," the boy whispered. "Mostly the old songs from church." Ashley nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She turned back to her tasks, but the quiet melody followed her, weaving hope into the morning like golden thread through homespun cloth. Perhaps here, in this remote cabin with these wounded souls, she could find not just shelter, but healing. The coffee pot bubbled cheerfully on the stove. Soon, Jonas would come in for breakfast, and they would begin another day of careful circles around each other, learning to share space and silence. But something had shifted, as subtle as morning frost, and just as transformative. Where yesterday there had been 3 strangers bound by circumstance, today held the first delicate seeds of family. Ashley rolled out biscuit dough with steady hands, adding an extra measure of care to each fold and turn. Outside, Jonas's humming blended with the wind in the pines and the distant cry of a mourning bird. Inside, Toby set the table with painstaking precision, proudly using the skills he'd learned in this makeshift home. The sun rose higher, warming the frost into diamonds that slid down the window panes. Ashley watched them fall, remembering her father's words about how God works in mysterious ways. Yesterday's tears had frozen into today's beauty, just as her shattered dreams might yet bloom into something new and unexpected in this mountain sanctuary. She smoothed her apron and began another day in her new life, carrying that spark of trust like a lantern in her heart. The days flowed one into another, like water over mountain stones. Ashley found her hands growing stronger, her steps more sure as she learned the rhythms of life at the high cabin. Each morning brought new lessons in survival, and though her muscles ached, she met each challenge with quiet determination. The water pump stood 50 yards from the cabin, requiring multiple trips each day. At first, the heavy buckets made her arms tremble, sloshing precious drops onto the frozen ground. But she refused to ask for help, even when her shoulders burned. By the end of the first week, she had learned to balance the weight more evenly, finding a steady pace that conserved both water and strength. "You're getting better at that," Toby observed one morning, falling into step beside her as she carried 2 full buckets back to the cabin. His dark eyes sparkled with approval. "Jonas says you're tougher than you look." Ashley felt warmth bloom in her chest at the unexpected praise. "Did he now?" She kept her voice light, though her heart quickened. "Well, I reckon there's no point in complaining when work needs doing." The boy nodded sagely. "That's what Jonas always says too." Inside the cabin, Ashley poured the fresh water into the kitchen barrel, saving some for the wash basin. Her hands had grown rough from work, but they moved with increasing confidence as she prepared breakfast. The familiar routines of cooking and cleaning anchored her days, giving structure to a life that still felt strange and uncertain. After the morning meal, Toby offered to teach her to snowshoe. "Winter's coming fast," he explained, showing her the wooden frames he and Jonas had made. "You'll need to know how to use these when the snow gets deep." The lesson proved harder than Ashley expected. She struggled to find her balance, the unfamiliar bindings making her ankles wobble. More than once she pitched forward into the powdery snow, earning gentle laughter from her young teacher. "Don't worry," Toby reassured her, helping her up after another fall. "Jonas says everyone falls at first. Even he did when he was learning." "I find that hard to believe," Ashley said, brushing snow from her skirts. She couldn't imagine the sure-footed mountain man ever stumbling. "It's true," Toby's face lit up with the memory. "He told me about when he first came here. Said he spent more time sitting in snowdrifts than walking on them." By midday, Ashley had mastered the basic stepping motion. Her victories were small, managing 10 steps without falling, turning in a wobbly circle, but each one felt significant. Toby proved an patient instructor, demonstrating the proper technique again and again until she got it right. The afternoon found her at her familiar seat by the window, mending clothes with practiced stitches. The cabin's sparse furnishings told stories of hard use: worn spots on Jonas's wool shirts, patches on Toby's trousers, frayed edges everywhere she looked. Her needle flew steadily, bringing order to the chaos one careful stitch at a time. The iron stove needed feeding every few hours to keep the cabin warm. Ashley had learned to gauge its hunger by the sound of the flames, adding wood before the temperature could drop. But as she reached to adjust a smoking log, her hand slipped. Pain flared bright and immediate. She couldn't hold back a sharp cry. The burn blazed across her palm, angry red against her pale skin. Before she could move, Jonas was beside her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the injury. "Toby," he called, voice tight with concern. "Fetch snow from outside, quick now." The boy darted out and returned with a handful of fresh powder. Jonas pressed it carefully against Ashley's palm, his calloused fingers cradling her wrist. The snow's bite helped dull the pain, but Ashley found herself more aware of Jonas's touch, the first time he had reached for her since their hurried wedding. "Hold that there," he instructed, moving to the shelf where he kept medical supplies. He returned with a small jar of green salve that smelled of herbs and pine. "This'll help. Made it myself from yarrow and comfrey." Ashley watched as he spread the cooling mixture over her burn with careful precision. His face was intent, brow furrowed in concentration. This close, she could see the scar that ran from his temple to jaw, old and silvered now, but still evident. She wondered what story it held, but knew better than to ask. "Thank you," she said softly when he finished wrapping her hand in clean cloth. "You're very kind." Jonas stepped back quickly, as if her gratitude made him uncomfortable. "Ain't kindness, just practical. Can't have you unable to work with winter coming on." That evening, storm clouds gathered thick and dark above the mountains. Wind moaned through the pine boughs, rattling the cabin's windows. Ashley sat close to the fire, her bandaged hand resting in her lap as she listened to the weather's fury. "Would you read to us?" Toby asked suddenly, pointing to the Bible she'd brought from home. "My mother used to read sometimes, before she went to walk with the ancestors. I miss hearing the stories." Ashley glanced at Jonas, who sat in his usual chair by the hearth. He gave a slight nod, though his expression remained guarded. She opened the worn volume carefully, its familiar pages offering comfort. "Which story would you like to hear?" "The one about the shepherd who looks for his lost sheep," Toby requested, settling cross-legged at her feet. Ashley found the passage in Luke, her voice rising clear and steady above the storm's rumble. "What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he lose one of them, doth not leave the 99 in the wilderness, and go after that which is lost, until he find it?" As she read, the wind's voice seemed to soften, as if it too were listening. Toby leaned against her knee, his eyes half closed in contentment. And Jonas sat perfectly still, his face turned toward the fire, but she knew he was absorbing every word. When she finished the chapter, silence filled the cabin like a warm blanket. Outside, snow fell in thick curtains, piling against the walls and windows. "Been years," Jonas said at last, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite hide. "Years since I heard scripture spoken aloud." Ashley smiled gently, touched by the admission. "We could make it a regular evening custom, if you'd like." He looked at her then, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes. But the moment passed quickly, and he turned away, rising to check the windows against the storm. Through the night, snow continued to fall. Ashley lay awake on her cot, listening to its soft shushing against the roof. The storm was sealing them in, cutting off the narrow trail to town until spring thaw. She should have felt trapped, perhaps even frightened at the prospect of months isolated with virtual strangers. Instead, she felt an odd sense of peace. Here in this snug cabin, with Toby's quiet breathing from the loft and Jonas's solid presence in the barn, she had found, if not happiness, then at least purpose. Her burned hand throbbed gently beneath its bandage, reminding her of Jonas's unexpected gentleness. Like the scripture she'd read, something lost was slowly being found. Not just safety or shelter, but the first tentative threads of belonging. The wind sang winter's lullaby, and snow drifted deeper around the cabin's walls. Ashley pulled her quilt closer, her prayers a whisper in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring more water to haul, more clothes to mend, more lessons in survival. But tonight, in this moment between storms, hope bloomed as delicate and precious as the first spring flower pushing through mountain snow. Long after Toby's breathing had settled into sleep, Ashley heard Jonas return from the barn. His footsteps paused near her cot, and for a moment she felt his presence there, as if he were standing guard. Then he moved away, settling into his chair by the dying fire. The cabin creaked and sighed around them, holding its small family safe as winter laid its white blanket across the mountain world. The blizzard descended without warning, transforming the afternoon into a howling white darkness. Inside the cabin, Ashley stoked the fire higher as wind rattled the window panes. Toby huddled near the hearth, whittling a piece of pine, while snow pelted against the logs like tiny fists. "Storm's getting worse," Jonas muttered, returning from checking the animals in the barn. Ice crystals clung to his beard, and his shoulders were dusted white. "Might last through the night." Ashley handed him a cup of hot coffee, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "The horses are settled?" He nodded, warming his hands around the tin cup. "Covered them good with blankets. They'll weather it fine." The evening stretched long as the storm raged. Ashley mended by lamplight while Toby spread his bedroll near the fire, claiming the cold drove him from his usual place in the loft. Jonas sat in his chair, staring into the flames as if they held answers to unspoken questions. The wind's voice changed as night deepened, becoming a mournful keen that made the shadows dance. Ashley noticed Jonas growing more restless with each gust. His fingers drummed against his knee, and his eyes held a haunted distance she'd never seen before. "Sounds like souls crying," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ashley set aside her mending, sensing something important in his words. "The wind?" "No." He swallowed hard. "The fire. When they..." His words faltered, but Ashley waited patiently, her heart beating faster at this first crack in his silence. Toby lay still on his bedroll, eyes closed but breathing too carefully to be truly asleep. The boy seemed to sense, as Ashley did, that this moment was delicate as spring ice. "It was during the war," Jonas continued finally, his deep voice rough with memory. "I was scouting for the Union Army in Tennessee. Winter night, cold as this one. Made camp in what I thought was an abandoned barn." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Jonas flinched slightly but went on. "Lit a small fire for warmth, kept it contained best I could. But the hay was bone dry, and a spark must have..." He drew a shaking breath. "By the time I woke, the whole place was ablaze. Didn't know until too late there were people sleeping in the loft. Refugees, mostly women and children." Ashley's hands tightened in her lap as understanding dawned. This was the burden he'd carried up the mountain, the weight that bent his broad shoulders. "I tried to help them out, but the stairs had already gone. The screams..." His voice broke. "There was a little girl. Couldn't have been more than 6 years old. I saw her face at the window just for a moment, before the roof came down." Tears gleamed in the lamplight as they rolled down his scarred cheek. "Been carrying their souls ever since. Some nights, when the wind howls like this, I can still hear them crying." Ashley moved without thinking, crossing to kneel beside his chair. She didn't touch him, but her presence seemed to steady him. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly. "You didn't mean for it to happen." "Doesn't matter what I meant," he replied bitterly. "My fire killed them just the same. Been trying to make it right ever since, but how do you repay such a debt? How do you earn forgiveness for something like that?" The lamp flickered as another gust rattled the windows. Ashley's voice, when she spoke, was gentle but firm. "Forgiveness isn't earned, Jonas. It's given. Freely, like grace itself." He turned to look at her then, his eyes wet with decades of grief. "How can you say that? You don't know the weight of what I've done." "No," she agreed, "but I know the weight of carrying shame, and I know that God's mercy is bigger than our mistakes, even the terrible ones we can't forget." Jonas's jaw trembled as he struggled with her words. Ashley continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The very fact that it haunts you so shows the goodness in your heart. A truly evil man wouldn't care about those lives lost." From his bedroll, Toby shifted slightly, drawing their attention. The boy's eyes remained closed, but there was a small smile on his face, as if even in sleep he felt the healing taking place in the cabin. "When you found Toby," Ashley said carefully, "when you took him in and gave him a home, was that not a way of making amends? Not to erase the past, but to prove that life and love can grow even from the ashes of our worst moments?" Jonas looked at the sleeping boy, his expression softening. He needed someone, like those children needed someone that night. "And you were there for him," Ashley reminded him. "You chose to be there." The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, something shifted in the atmosphere. Jonas's shoulders seemed to lose some of their rigid tension. Though he didn't speak again, his breathing grew steadier, calmer. Ashley returned to her seat, picking up her mending. The familiar motion of needle and thread helped settle her own emotions. She understood now why Jonas had chosen this isolated place, why he worked so hard to protect others, why he'd stepped forward in that church to save her from humiliation. Every act of kindness was a step toward redemption, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and Toby's breathing deepened into genuine sleep. When Ashley finally laid down on her cot, she saw Jonas still sitting in his chair, but his face looked different in the dying firelight. Less haunted, more at peace. The storm began to fade as dawn approached. Ashley woke to gray light filtering through frosted windows and the rhythmic sound of chopping wood. Rising quietly so as not to wake Toby, she wrapped her shawl tight and went to the door. Jonas stood at the woodpile, his breath clouding in the cold morning air. His movements were sure and strong as he split log after log. But it was his face that made her pause. The perpetual crease between his brows had smoothed, and his expression held a calmness she'd never seen before. He noticed her watching and paused, axe resting against the stump. For the first time since their hasty wedding, he met her eyes directly, holding her gaze for a long moment. No words passed between them, but Ashley felt the change as clearly as she felt the crisp morning air on her face. Something had begun to heal in the night's confessions, not just in Jonas, but in the space between them. Behind her, Toby's voice called from inside the cabin, asking about breakfast. The spell broke, and Ashley turned to go back inside. But as she reached for the door handle, she heard Jonas speak softly. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying clearly in the still morning air. "For listening, for—" He trailed off, unable to find the right words, but Ashley understood. "You're welcome," she replied simply, and went inside to start the day. The snow lay deep and pristine around the cabin, transformed by the storm into a clean white blanket that covered all the scars of yesterday. As Ashley began preparing breakfast, she smiled to herself, hearing Jonas resume his steady rhythm with the axe. Outside their windows, the sun broke through the clouds, setting the new fallen snow to sparkling like countless tiny stars. The days following Jonas's confession brought subtle but meaningful changes to life in the mountain cabin. Where silence had once ruled, warm sounds of daily living now filled the space. The scrape of chairs on wooden floors, the bubbling of stew in the iron pot, and most remarkably, occasional laughter. One crisp morning, Ashley watched from the doorway as Toby returned from checking his rabbit snares. The boy's quick feet left small tracks in the fresh powder, and his breath came out in excited puffs as he held up his prize, 2 plump rabbits dangling from a string. "Look what I caught," he called out proudly. "Jonas showed me how to set the snares just right." Ashley smiled, noting how the boy's eyes shone with pride. "That's wonderful, Toby. Those will make a fine stew." As she helped him clean the rabbits, she noticed charcoal smudges on his fingers. "What's this?" she asked, pointing to the marks. Toby ducked his head sheepishly. "Was trying to write my name like in your Bible, but the letters don't look right." Ashley's heart warmed at his desire to learn. Looking around the cabin, she spotted some scraps of wood near Jonas's workbench. "Would you like me to teach you?" Toby's face lit up like sunrise on fresh snow. "Could you? Really?" "Of course." She retrieved a piece of charred wood from the fireplace and selected a smooth plank. "Let's start with your name." They sat together at the rough-hewn table, and Ashley carefully drew the letters T-O-B-Y. "See? Each letter has its own shape, like tracks in the snow. This one looks like a cross," she explained, pointing to the T. Toby's small hand wrapped around the charred stick, his tongue poking out in concentration as he tried to copy the letters. His first attempts were wobbly, but Ashley praised his effort, guiding his hand gently. "That's it," she encouraged. "Just like following a trail, one mark at a time." From his workbench across the cabin, Jonas watched them quietly, his hands busy with a piece of wood he'd been carefully shaping. The sound of their quiet instruction filled the cabin with a peaceful rhythm. Ashley's patient explanations, Toby's determined efforts, and the scratch of charcoal on wood. As the morning wore on, Toby's letters grew steadier. Soon he could write not only his name, but simple words like cat and dog. His face beamed with each small victory. "Jonas!" he called out excitedly. "Look, I wrote your name too." Jonas set aside his project and crossed to the table, examining Toby's work. His large, calloused finger traced the shaky letters. "Well done," he said softly, and Toby practically glowed at the praise. Throughout the day, Ashley noticed Jonas returning to his mysterious woodworking project whenever he wasn't tending to outside chores. His big hands moved with surprising delicacy over the wood, carefully carving and smoothing. As evening approached, Ashley began preparing supper. She mixed cornmeal with the last of their buttermilk, forming small cakes that she set to fry in the cast-iron skillet. The venison stew that had been simmering all day filled the cabin with rich, savory aromas. The familiar sounds of Jonas stamping snow from his boots announced his return from checking the trap lines. He paused in the doorway, breathing in deeply. "Smells like heaven in here," he said, his voice gruff but warm. Ashley felt her cheeks flush at the compliment. "Supper's nearly ready. Toby, would you help set the table?" The boy jumped up eagerly, carefully placing their tin plates and cups. As they gathered around the table, Jonas cleared his throat. "Before we eat," he said, reaching for something behind his chair, "I have something for you, Ashley." He held out a wooden comb, beautifully carved from a single piece of pine. The teeth were perfectly spaced, and the handle was adorned with delicate carved flowers. Mountain columbines, she realized with surprise. "I noticed yours was broken," he explained awkwardly. "Thought you might could use a new one." Ashley took the comb with trembling fingers, running her thumb over the smooth wood and intricate details. "It's beautiful," she whispered, understanding now all his secret work at the bench. "Thank you, Jonas." Their eyes met across the table, and something warm and uncertain flickered between them. Toby looked back and forth between them, grinning. The moment broke when Ashley remembered the corn cakes, hurrying to flip them before they burned. Soon they were all seated, steam rising from their bowls of stew. Ashley had crumbled the corn cakes on top, just as her mother used to do. Jonas took a bite and closed his eyes briefly. "This is real fine cooking," he said. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, he added, "Makes this place feel like home." Ashley's heart skipped at his words. She looked around the cabin, at Toby's letters proudly displayed on the wall, at Jonas's gentle handling of the wooden spoon, at the way the firelight made everything glow with warmth. Home. Yes, that's exactly what it had become. After supper they gathered near the hearth. The storm that had raged for days had finally passed, and moonlight streamed through the windows, making the snow outside glow with an ethereal light. Ashley took out her Bible, as had become their custom, but tonight felt different, more intimate, more like family. "Would you read the 23rd Psalm?" Jonas asked, his voice soft. "The one about still waters?" Ashley opened to the familiar passage, but before she could begin, Toby scooted closer. "Can I try to read some? Ashley's been teaching me the letters." "Of course," she said, moving so he could see better. She pointed to each word as Toby carefully sounded them out, Jonas mouthing the familiar words along with him. "The Lord is my shepherd," Toby read, slowly. "I shall not want." When it came time for evening prayers, they formed a circle, joining hands as naturally as breathing. Ashley felt Jonas's rough palm against hers, warm and strong. When their fingers touched, neither pulled away. Instead, they remained connected, their linked hands bridging years of loneliness and hurt. They stayed that way through the prayer, Toby's small hand completing the circle. Ashley felt something settle in her heart, a certainty that this was right, that God had led her to this mountain not as punishment but as blessing. When they finally separated, Jonas's fingers lingered against hers for just a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met in the dying firelight, and Ashley saw in his face the same wonder she felt, that somehow, in this remote cabin, they had found something precious and unexpected. That night, as Ashley lay on her cot, she heard Jonas humming softly as he banked the fire, an old hymn about grace and redemption. Toby's steady breathing joined the peaceful chorus of night sounds, the settling of logs in the fireplace, the distant cry of an owl, the whisper of wind in the pines. The next morning dawned crystal clear, the storm-swept sky a perfect blue. Sunlight sparkled on fresh snow, making the world look new-made and full of possibility. Ashley stood in the doorway, breathing in the crisp air, feeling hope rise in her heart, like the sun over the mountains. Behind her, she heard Jonas and Toby moving about the cabin, starting their day. The wooden comb Jonas had carved sat in her apron pocket, a tangible reminder of how far they'd come from that desperate day in the church. She touched it gently, smiling as she turned back to join her family for breakfast. They gathered at the table, and this time when Jonas reached for her hand to pray, it felt as natural as breathing. Toby's gap-toothed grin spread across his face as he watched them, and Ashley knew the boy saw what she felt. Love growing as surely as his letters formed words, as steadily as Jonas's hands had carved beauty from raw wood. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the rising steam from their coffee cups and making it dance like glory. Outside, a fresh day beckoned, full of promise and new beginnings. But here, in this moment, Ashley knew she had already found everything she needed, not in spite of her broken dreams, but because of them. The first hint of Jonas's illness came on a bitter morning in late winter. He'd risen before dawn as usual, but Ashley noticed his movements were slower, less certain. By midday, a sheen of sweat covered his forehead despite the biting cold. "You ought to rest," Ashley said, touching his arm as he struggled to stack firewood. "You're burning up." Jonas shook his head. "Got work needs doing." But his voice rasped, and he swayed slightly where he stood. Before he could protest further, his knees buckled. Ashley caught his weight as best she could, calling out to Toby, who was nearby feeding the chickens. Together they helped Jonas into the cabin and onto his bed. "I'm fine," Jonas muttered, but his eyes were glazed with fever. "Just need to catch my breath." Ashley pressed her palm to his forehead, feeling the alarming heat. "Toby, fetch fresh snow in the bucket. We need to cool him down." The boy darted outside, while Ashley began unlacing Jonas's boots. His skin burned through his clothes, and his breathing came in rough gasps. "Don't fuss," Jonas whispered. "Not worth the trouble." Ashley's heart clenched at his words. Even now he thought himself undeserving of care. "Hush," she said firmly. "Every soul is worth the trouble." Toby returned with the snow, and Ashley wrapped some in a cloth to place on Jonas's forehead. She sent the boy to gather pine needles and the dried herbs she kept in the root cellar, remedies her mother had taught her long ago. As the day wore into evening, Jonas's fever climbed higher. He tossed restlessly, muttering words Ashley couldn't quite catch. She kept vigil by his bedside, replacing the snow compresses as they melted, spooning herbal tea between his cracked lips whenever he was lucid enough to swallow. Toby refused to leave, curling up in Jonas's chair nearby. His dark eyes watched every movement, every labored breath. "He won't die, will he?" the boy whispered. Ashley reached out to squeeze his hand. "No, dear heart, we won't let him." Night fell, bringing with it the worst of Jonas's fever. His mumbling grew clearer, though his eyes remained unfocused. Ashley realized he was reliving moments from his past, the war, the fire, the faces of those he couldn't save. "I'm sorry," he moaned, thrashing against the quilts. "Should have checked the wind. Should have known better. The children." "Shh," Ashley soothed, wiping his face with a cool cloth. "You're safe now. God's mercy is new every morning." She reached for her Bible, worn and familiar in her hands. Opening to Psalm 51, she began to read aloud. "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness. According unto the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgressions." Jonas grew quieter as she read, as if the ancient words of repentance and forgiveness spoke directly to his tormented soul. Toby joined in where he knew the verses, his young voice mixing with Ashley's in the lamplight. Through the long hours, Ashley kept reading, kept bathing Jonas's fevered skin, kept praying. Toby finally dozed off in the chair, but she couldn't rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jonas's face the day he'd stepped into the church to save her from shame. Now it was her turn to help him. Near dawn, Jonas's fever finally broke. The terrible heat began to fade from his skin, and his breathing eased. Ashley, exhausted beyond measure, found herself slumping forward, her head coming to rest near his hand on the bed. Just for a moment, she told herself, closing her heavy eyes. The pale light of morning woke her. She lifted her head to find Jonas watching her, his eyes clear for the first time in days. "You stayed," he said softly, wonder in his voice. Ashley straightened, smoothing her wrinkled apron. "Of course I stayed." Toby stirred in his chair, rubbing his eyes. When he saw Jonas awake, he launched himself across the room. "You're better," Jonas managed a weak smile. "Seems so, thanks to good doctoring." His gaze returned to Ashley, heavy with meaning. She busied herself preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush, sweetened with the last of their molasses. Jonas insisted on sitting up, though she could see how it taxed his strength. As they ate, the morning sun streamed through the frost-covered windows, catching the steam rising from their bowls. The familiar routine felt different now, hallowed somehow by the night they'd passed through together. "Never known anyone as strong as you," Jonas said quietly, watching Ashley as she cleared away the dishes. "Most folks would have run from such trouble." She paused, remembering his feverish confessions. "Strength isn't about running or staying," she said. "It's about trusting God's purpose, even when the path is hard." Jonas nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. They'd both walked hard paths to reach this place. The next day, Jonas was strong enough to sit in his chair by the fire. Ashley worked at her mending nearby, humming softly as she sewed. It took her a moment to realize what tune she'd chosen, the same hymn she'd heard Jonas hum so many times before. A deep voice joined hers, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. Their voices twined together in the quiet cabin, singing of amazing grace and precious faith. Toby listened, wide-eyed, then added his clear treble to the harmony. Ashley's needle moved steadily through the fabric as they sang, each stitch a quiet prayer of gratitude. The morning light painted everything in soft gold, and the lingering fear of the past few days melted away like frost in sunshine. Jonas's hand found hers, as the last notes faded. His palm was cool now, his grip sure. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered was there in the touch of their fingers, in the peaceful silence that followed the song, in the way Toby beamed at them both. Outside, a late winter wind rattled the cabin walls, but inside, warmth bloomed like spring. Ashley looked at Jonas, seeing not the fearsome mountain man of legend, but simply a soul learning to trust again. His eyes held hers, full of something that looked very much like hope. Toby broke the moment by announcing he was hungry. Ashley laughed and rose to start preparing their midday meal, but Jonas caught her hand once more. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing past what others fear." She squeezed his fingers gently before letting go. That's what family does. The word hung in the air between them, precious and true. They'd started as strangers bound by desperate circumstances, but somewhere between wedding, bells, and sickbed vigils, they'd become something more. Something neither of them had dared to hope for. Ashley moved about the cabin, gathering ingredients for soup, while Jonas instructed Toby in whittling a new piece of wood. Their voices mixed with the homey sounds of cooking and the crackle of the fire, creating a melody sweeter than any hymn. The shadow of Jonas's fever had passed, but it had left something vital in its wake. A deeper understanding, a stronger trust, a surer faith that God could indeed make all things new. The mountain snows surrendered to spring's warm embrace, melting into rushing streams that carved paths down the slopes. The sound of water filled the valley, trickling, rushing, roaring with life renewed. Near the cabin's weathered porch, Ashley knelt in the freshly thawed earth, her hands dark with soil as she carefully planted wildflower seeds she'd traded for at winter's end. "What color will they be, Miss Ashley?" Toby bounced on his toes beside her, eager to help but distracted by every chipmunk that darted past. "Blues and purples mostly," she replied, patting the soil gently. "Mountain columbine and lupine. Maybe some Indian paintbrush too if we're blessed." She smiled as Toby took off after another chipmunk, his laughter echoing against the cabin walls. Above them, Jonas moved steadily across the roof, replacing shingles loosened by winter storms. His movements were sure and strong now, all traces of his illness gone. The sound of his hammer rang out in steady rhythm, punctuated by the occasional whistle of a familiar hymn. Ashley sat back on her heels, shading her eyes to watch him work. The spring sunshine caught his profile, softening the scar that had once seemed so fearsome to her. When he noticed her gaze, he smiled. A real smile that reached his eyes, not the guarded expression he'd worn in earlier days. "Roof will be sound before the summer rains," he called down. "Might even add that window you were hoping for. Let more light into the kitchen." Her heart warmed at his thoughtfulness. These days, Jonas seemed to anticipate her needs before she voiced them, as if her comfort had become as natural a concern to him as checking his trap lines or teaching Toby to track. "Much obliged," she replied, using the frontier phrase that had become familiar to her tongue. "Though I reckon we ought to head to town first, trade those winter pelts before the prices drop." Jonas's hammer paused mid-swing. They hadn't been back to Silver Creek since their wedding day, when he'd stood in for Caden Weller at the altar. Ashley knew he worried how the town would treat her, but they couldn't avoid it forever. "Suppose you're right," he agreed finally, climbing down the ladder. "Weather's fair enough for the wagon trail." They set out early the next morning, Toby wedged between them on the wagon seat, chattering about all the things he hoped to see in town. The boy had opened up like a flower in sunshine since Ashley's arrival. No longer the shy creature who'd hidden behind the hearth that first night. The familiar scent of pine gave way to sage as they descended from the mountains. Ashley's stomach tightened as Silver Creek's white steeple came into view. Jonas must have sensed her tension, for his hand found hers on the seat between them. "Remember," he said softly, "you've nothing to be ashamed of." The wagon rattled down the main street, past the general store where women gathered to gossip, past the saloon where men lounged on the porch. Heads turned. Whispers followed. "Ain't that the Winton girl?" "The one Caden Weller left at the altar. Married the mountain man instead." "What kind of woman would—" Jonas's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward, his hand steady on Ashley's. She lifted her chin, refusing to shrink from the stares. Let them whisper. They knew nothing of the peace she'd found in that mountain cabin, of the gentle heart behind Jonas's scarred exterior. They stopped first at Hanson's trading post to sell the pelts, prime beaver and marten that brought a fair price. Ashley selected seeds and supplies while Jonas haggled, and Toby pressed his nose against the candy jars until Jonas slipped him a peppermint stick. Outside the store, they encountered Pastor Matthews, his kind face creased with genuine pleasure at seeing them. "Ashley, Jonas," he greeted warmly, "and young Toby, too. It does my heart good to see you all looking so well." "Thank you, Pastor," Ashley replied, touched by his sincerity. "We've been blessed this winter." "That's plain to see." The old man's eyes twinkled. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, but his plans are always perfect in the end." As they spoke with the pastor, Ashley felt another gaze burning into her back. She turned slightly to see Caden Weller watching from across the street, his handsome face rigid with something like shock or envy. He'd clearly expected to find her diminished by his rejection, perhaps hoping she'd come crawling back once the scandal died down. Instead, she stood tall beside her mountain man husband, her face glowing with health and purpose, while Toby grinned up at her with absolute trust. Jonas's arm slipped protectively around her waist, a gesture so natural it surprised her. There was nothing possessive in his touch, only steadfast support. Caden's face darkened, and he turned sharply away. They completed their errands efficiently, mail collected, supplies loaded, a few necessary items ordered for later delivery. Through it all, Jonas stayed close, his quiet presence a shield against curious eyes and wagging tongues. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin again, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. While Jonas and Toby unloaded the wagon, Ashley lit the lamps and started supper, moving through the familiar routine with gratitude in her heart. Later, as night settled over the mountain, she took out the small leather journal Jonas had surprised her with at the trading post. By lamplight, she wrote, "Today I realized I no longer feel like a cast-off, a woman who wasn't good enough to keep Caden Weller's love. How strange that I once thought his rejection would break me. Instead, it led me here, to this cabin, to this family we're building day by day. Jonas doesn't speak his feelings often, but I see them in every gentle action, every careful thought for my comfort. And Toby, dear, wonderful Toby, fills our home with such life and laughter. We are not what anyone in Silver Creek would call a proper family, perhaps. But we are real and true and blessed beyond measure." She closed the journal, listening to the comfortable sounds of home, the crackle of the fire, the wind in the pines outside, and best of all, Jonas's quiet laughter as Toby acted out a tale about the clever rabbit who outsmarted the coyote. "And then," Toby exclaimed, bouncing on his knees, "the rabbit jumped right over the coyote's head, just like this." He demonstrated with enthusiasm, nearly upending his cup of milk. Jonas steadied the cup with one hand, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Careful there, son, though I reckon that rabbit was nearly as lively as you." Ashley watched them from her rocking chair, her mending forgotten in her lap. Jonas caught her eye across the room, and the look they shared held all the warmth of spring sunshine. She didn't need his words to know that he, too, was marveling at how complete their little family felt. The evening wrapped around them like a quilt, soft and secure. Ashley's needle found its rhythm again as Toby continued his story, and Jonas whittled a new spinning top for the boy. Outside, the creek sang its spring song, full of promise and new beginnings. Gone was the awkward silence of their first days together, replaced by the comfortable quiet of people who knew they belonged to each other. Even the cabin itself seemed to have grown warmer, more welcoming, as if it too had been waiting for the right souls to make it truly home. Toby's story wound down as his eyelids grew heavy. Jonas scooped him up with practiced ease, carrying him to his bed in the corner. Ashley heard him murmur the familiar blessing. "Sleep sweet, son. Creator, watch over your dreams." When Jonas returned to his chair, Ashley noticed how his eyes lingered on her, soft with contentment. No matter what Silver Creek thought of their unusual marriage, she knew with bone-deep certainty that they'd found something rare and precious here in their mountain sanctuary. The fire settled into coals, and the lamp burned low, but neither of them moved to end the evening just yet. Some moments deserved to be savored, held close like treasures. This was one of them. This perfect spring night, with love blooming as surely as the wildflowers she'd planted by the porch. The mountain morning dawned crisp and clear, 3 days after their return from Silver Creek. Ashley hummed as she hung fresh linens on, the line watching them snap in the spring breeze. The sound of hoofbeats made her pause, shading her eyes against the sun. A lone rider approached up the narrow trail, dust rising behind his horse. As he drew closer, Ashley recognized Deputy Marshal Wilson's weathered face beneath his badge. Her heart skipped. Lawmen rarely brought good news to remote homesteads. Jonas emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers. He nodded a greeting as the deputy dismounted, but Ashley saw tension in the set of his shoulders. "Morning, Creed," Wilson said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Creed, got a telegram here needs delivering." He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. Ashley's fingers trembled as she took it. The yellow paper crackled as she unfolded it, Jonas reading over her shoulder. The words struck like hammer blows. "Notice of legal action, stop Caden Weller. Files for marriage annulment, stop claims coercion and water rights, theft. Stop Jonas Creed to appear before Judge Harrison in 2 days' time." Stop the world seemed to tilt beneath Ashley's feet. "Coercion?" she whispered. "Water rights?" Jonas's expression hardened to granite. His hands, gentle that morning while helping her with breakfast, curled into fists at his sides. "There's more," Deputy Wilson said, producing an official-looking document. "Court order requiring your presence, Creed. Judge Harrison wants this settled proper-like." 2 days? Ashley found her voice. "That's barely time to make arrangements." "Law's the law, ma'am." Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Mr. Weller's lawyer was mighty insistent on swift action. Jonas took the court order, his scarred face unreadable. "Much obliged for the delivery, Deputy." Wilson nodded, clearly relieved to be done with his unpleasant task. He turned his horse, paused, and added quietly, "Watch yourself, Creed. Weller's got friends in high places." They watched him ride away, the telegram's words burning between them. Toby peeked out from behind the cabin door, sensing the tension. "What's wrong?" he asked, eyes wide with worry. "Nothing for you to fret about," Jonas assured him, but his voice was rough. "Go on and finish your reading lesson." Once Toby was inside, Ashley gripped Jonas's arm. "This is nonsense. You never coerced me. I chose to marry you. And what water rights is he talking about? The creek that runs through your father's old property, Jonas explained quietly. Rights passed to you when he died. Valuable thing in these parts. But I never... Understanding dawned. That's why Caden courted me. He wanted the water rights all along. Jonas nodded grimly. Man like that, everything's about profit. Ashley paced the yard, her mind racing. We'll fight this. We'll tell the judge the truth about that day in the church, about Caden abandoning me. No. Jonas's voice was flat. She whirled to face him. What do you mean, no? Won't drag you through more scandal. Won't fight. Jonas Creed, don't you dare give up. Heat filled her cheeks. This is our marriage he's trying to destroy. Our family. Jonas walked to the fence post, bracing his hands against the rough wood. You don't understand. Fighting means lawyers, means stirring up the past, means questions about the war, about what I did. Then let them ask, Ashley followed him. You've carried that guilt long enough. God has forgiven you. I won't risk violence again, he cut in, not even in a courtroom, not even to defend my name. His eyes met hers, full of pain. I've seen what pride and anger can destroy. Won't let that happen again. Ashley watched helplessly as he strode to the barn. Minutes later, he emerged leading his horse, already saddled. Where are you going? Need to think. He swung into the saddle. Back by sunset. She stood in the yard until he disappeared into the pines, the telegram crushed in her fist. Inside, she found Toby pretending to read, his face pinched with worry. Is Jonas in trouble? He asked. Ashley smoothed his dark hair. Some people in town are being unkind, but we'll manage. She kept herself busy through the afternoon, cooking, cleaning, mending. But her thoughts churned like storm clouds. When Jonas returned at dusk, his face was set with decision. I'll ride to town tomorrow, he said over supper. Face the judge. We'll ride to town, Ashley corrected firmly. I'm going with you. He started to protest, but she held up her hand. I'm your wife, Jonas. Where you go, I go. Someone needs to watch over Toby. Sarah Whitman on the lower trail can take him. She's been kind to us, and her boys would welcome his company. Jonas's shoulders slumped slightly, as if a weight had been lifted by not having to face this alone. We'll leave at dawn. That night, Ashley lay awake long after Jonas had gone to sleep in his chair by the fire. She'd thought the worst was behind them. The scandal of being left at the altar, the whispers about marrying the scarred mountain man. Now Caden threatened everything they'd built together. She rose before sunrise, packing food for the journey while Jonas readied the horses. Toby helped, unnaturally quiet. You'll come back? He asked suddenly, his voice small. Ashley hugged him fiercely. Of course we will. This is our home. All of us together. They dropped Toby at the Whitman Ranch, where Sarah welcomed him warmly. Don't fret about the boy, she assured them. We'll keep him busy. The trail to Silver Creek seemed longer than Ashley remembered. Jonas rode beside her, speaking little. When they stopped to rest the horses at noon, she tried again to discuss their defense. The judge needs to understand what really happened that day. Ashley. Jonas's voice was gentle but firm. I meant what I said. Won't fight this with angry words or legal tricks. If the judge rules against us... He swallowed hard. Then maybe it's God's will. How can you say that? She stood, hands on her hips. God brought us together. He's given us a family, a home filled with love. You can't tell me he means for Caden's lies to destroy that. Jonas just shook his head, already mounting up. They rode on, the shadow of tomorrow's hearing hanging over them like storm clouds. In town, they took a room at the modest boarding house, rather than face the grander hotel where Caden usually stayed. The proprietor, Mrs. Chen, showed them to a clean but simple room with a single bed. "I'll sleep in the chair," Jonas said automatically. Ashley touched his arm. "You need real rest before tomorrow. The bed's plenty big enough for both of us." He hesitated, then nodded. They lay down fully clothed, a careful space between them. Ashley listened to his breathing in the dark, remembering all the nights she'd fallen asleep to that sound from across the cabin. "Jonas?" she whispered. "Hmm? I'm glad you married me. No matter what happens tomorrow, I want you to know that." His hand found hers in the darkness, rough fingers closing gently around her own. They fell asleep that way, anchored to each other against the storm to come. Dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, but neither of them noticed its beauty. They dressed carefully, Jonas in his best shirt, Ashley in a simple blue dress she'd made herself. Their breakfast sat mostly untouched. The courthouse loomed before them, its wooden steps already crowded with spectators drawn by gossip about the scandal. Ashley held her head high as they climbed those steps together, Jonas's solid presence beside her, a reminder of everything worth fighting for. Inside, the courtroom smelled of polish and tension. Caden sat near the front with his lawyer, every inch the prosperous rancher in his fine suit. He turned as they entered, his handsome face twisting with something like triumph. Ashley's grip tightened on Jonas's arm. Whatever came next, they would face it together, the mountain man and his seamstress wife, bound by something far stronger than Caden's schemes could break. Judge Harrison would arrive any minute now. Ashley sent up a silent prayer, not for victory, but for truth to prevail. She felt Jonas straighten beside her, preparing to face judgment for a marriage that had begun as mercy, but had grown into love. The morning light streamed through high windows, catching the dust motes like falling stars. Ashley thought of their cabin, waiting in the mountains, of Toby's worried face, of all the quiet moments that had knit their hearts together. She wouldn't let Caden steal that from them, not without a fight, even if she had to fight for all three of them. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison." The afternoon sun beat down on Silver Creek's dusty main street as Jonas and Ashley rode into town. Townsfolk stopped their business to stare, some ducking into doorways to whisper behind raised hands. Others made no effort to hide their disdain, glaring openly at the couple as they passed. Ashley sat straight in her saddle, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Jonas rode beside her, his face impassive but his shoulders tense. Their horses' hooves kicked up little clouds of dust that danced in the golden light. Outside the courthouse, Caden Weller stood on the steps like a king surveying his domain. His tailored suit and polished boots seemed to mock the simple clothes Ashley and Jonas wore. Beside him stood a sharp-featured man Ashley didn't recognize, dressed in an expensive Eastern suit that looked out of place in the frontier town. "That's Hallie," Jonas murmured. "Railroad man from Denver." Ashley's stomach tightened. Of course, the water rights. That's what this was really about. Her father's creek wasn't just a source of life anymore. It was a commodity to be bought and sold. Sheriff Doolin emerged from his office across the street, his weathered face grave. He approached slowly, spurs jingling with each deliberate step. The badge on his chest caught the sunlight. "Jonas," the sheriff said quietly. "Miss Ashley." "It's Mrs. Creed now," Ashley corrected, lifting her chin. Doolin nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Jonas, I've got papers here. Mr. Weller's sworn out an affidavit claiming you forced Mrs. Creed into marriage under duress to gain control of her water rights." "That's a lie," Ashley exclaimed. "Jonas saved me from humiliation when Caden abandoned me at the altar. Everyone in town saw it happen." The sheriff held up a calming hand. "Ma'am, I understand your feelings, but the law requires me to act on a sworn complaint. Jonas will have to come with me until the hearing." Jonas dismounted slowly, his movements careful and measured. "No trouble, Sheriff. I'll come peaceful." "Jonas, no!" Ashley scrambled down from her horse. "You can't just—" "Ashley!" Jonas's voice was gentle but firm. "Remember what I said about fighting?" She fell silent, tears burning in her eyes. The sheriff produced a set of iron manacles, the chains clinking softly. "I'm sorry about these, Jonas," Doolin said. "But regulations. Do what you need to, Sheriff." Jonas held out his wrists. The sound of the cuffs closing around Jonas's wrists made Ashley flinch. Across the street, Caden watched with obvious satisfaction, while Mr. Halley observed the scene with cold calculation in his eyes. "The hearing's set for 3 days from now," the sheriff explained. "Judge Harrison will hear both sides and make his ruling then." Ashley stepped forward. "I'm staying at the jail with my husband." "No," Jonas's voice was quiet but determined. "Go stay with the pastor's wife. Sarah needs to know you're safe and looked after." "But Jonas, please." His eyes met hers, full of concern. "Do this for me." Sheriff Doolin touched the brim of his hat. "I'll make sure he's treated proper, ma'am. You have my word." Ashley watched helplessly as the sheriff led Jonas away. The chains rattled with each step, the sound echoing off the poor wooden buildings. Townspeople lined the boardwalks, watching the spectacle of the feared mountain man being led away in chains. Caden approached, his boots clicking on the wooden sidewalk. "Ashley, this is all for the best. Once the marriage is annulled, we can—" "Don't you dare speak to me!" Her voice shook with fury. "I know what this is really about. You and your railroad friend want my father's water rights." Mr. Halley stepped forward, his manner smooth as silk. "Mrs. Creed, if I may still call you that, progress requires certain sacrifices. The railroad will bring prosperity to this entire valley. Surely you can see that's worth more than one small creek?" "That creek waters half the farms in the valley," Ashley shot back. "My father protected those water rights so families could survive, not so the railroad could steal them." "No one's stealing anything," Caden said. "Once the judge sees how Jonas manipulated you—" "The only manipulation here is yours, Caden Weller." Ashley gathered her horse's reins. "And God sees the truth, even when men try to hide it." She led both horses toward the church, refusing to give Caden the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, and thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was coming. The pastor's wife, Martha, welcomed Ashley with open arms. "Oh, my dear girl, come in, come in. Robert told me what happened." Inside the cozy parlor, Ashley finally let her tears fall. Martha held her while she sobbed, stroking her hair as if she were a child. There, Martha soothed. "Robert's gone to see Jonas now. We'll sort this out." "It's all my fault," Ashley whispered. "If I hadn't agreed to marry him that day. Stop that right now." Martha's voice was firm. "You did nothing wrong. Neither did Jonas. Some men just can't bear to see others find happiness they themselves threw away." Later that evening, Pastor Robert returned. His kind face was troubled as he joined them in the parlor. "Jonas is being treated well," he assured Ashley. "The sheriff's seeing to that. But he's worried about you, my dear. Says you shouldn't waste these days waiting at the jail." "He would say that." Ashley managed a weak smile. "Always thinking of others, even now." "Shall we pray together?" the pastor suggested gently. They bowed their heads as Robert's steady voice filled the room. "Lord, we come before you in this hour of trial. We ask for your justice to prevail, for truth to shine through darkness, for mercy to triumph over spite. Protect Jonas, comfort Ashley, and guide all hearts toward your righteousness. Amen." Amen, Ashley whispered, though her faith felt as shaky as autumn leaves in a storm. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, closer now. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the window panes. Ashley stared out into the gathering darkness, thinking of Jonas in his cell, hoping he could hear the rain too. Something about sharing even that small connection gave her comfort. Martha touched her shoulder. "Try to rest, dear. Tomorrow's another day." But Ashley knew sleep would be long in coming. Her mind kept returning to that morning in the church, when Jonas had stepped forward to save her dignity. How could anyone believe that quiet, gentle man had forced her into anything? The storm grew stronger, wind howling around the eaves of the house. Ashley knelt beside her bed, hands clasped in prayer. Her faith might waver, but it wouldn't break. Not now, when Jonas needed it most. "Lord," she prayed softly, "give me strength to fight this battle, not with fists or fury, but with truth and love. Help me be as brave as Jonas, as steady in my faith. And please, please protect him tonight." Thunder crashed overhead, but Ashley felt a curious peace settle over her. Perhaps it was an answer to prayer, or perhaps it was simply the certainty that love, real, sacrificial love like Jonas had shown her, couldn't be destroyed by lies and schemes. She thought of their cabin in the mountains, of Toby waiting anxiously for their return, of all the quiet moments that had slowly bound their hearts together. No matter what the judge decided, those things were real. Those things were true. The rain continued to fall, washing the dust from the streets of Silver Creek. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, Ashley let the steady rhythm of the storm lull her into uneasy sleep. Her last conscious thought, a prayer for the man who had become so much more than just her rescuer. He had become her home. In his cell, Jonas listened to the same rain, thinking of Ashley safe at the pastor's house, and thanked God for at least that small mercy. He had meant what he said about not fighting. Violence and anger had already cost him too much. But as he fingered the simple ring he wore, he allowed himself to pray that somehow truth and justice would prevail. The storm raged on through the night, nature's fury matching the turmoil in the small frontier town. But like all storms, this too would pass. The question was, what would remain standing when it cleared? Martha insisted on accompanying Ashley back to the cabin. The wagon wheel struggled through the muddy mountain trail as storm clouds gathered again overhead. When they arrived, Toby burst from the door and flung himself into Ashley's arms. "I was scared you weren't coming back." His small fingers clutched her dress. "Where's Jonas?" Ashley held him close, breathing in the pine scent of his hair. "The sheriff's keeping him in town for a few days, but he'll come home. I promise." She felt his shoulders trembling and added firmly, "Jonas is the strongest, bravest man I know. Everything will be all right." While Martha packed some clothes, Ashley knelt beside Jonas's cot. Something caught her eye underneath. A worn leather book wedged between the floorboards. She pulled it out carefully. It was a soldier's Bible, its pages yellow, with age and water-stained. Inside the cover, she saw J. Creed, 2nd Colorado Cavalry, written in faded ink. "I'll take this for comfort during the hearing," she murmured, tucking it inside her cloak. The next morning, heavy rain turned the trail into thick mud. Ashley embraced Toby one last time before sending him to stay with Whitehawk's family, kind Ute neighbors who often traded with Jonas. "Be brave," she whispered. "I'll come for you soon." Then she mounted her horse, Jonas's Bible pressed close to her heart beneath her heavy cloak. The rain pelted her face as she guided her mare down the slippery trail toward Silver Creek, praying for strength with each step. The small courthouse buzzed with whispers as Ashley entered. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Caden stood at the front, his boots polished and hat pristine, while Mr. Halley adjusted his silk tie with manicured fingers. "The defendant, Jonas Creed, coerced Miss Winton into marriage," Caden declared, his voice carrying. "He knew her water rights would be valuable to the railroad." The townsfolk shifted in their seats. Some nodded, while others frowned in doubt. Jonas sat silently, his shackled hands folded in his lap. When Ashley took the stand, her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. "Jonas Creed married me to save me from public shame," she testified. "He never once mentioned water rights or property. He offered me his name when another man broke his word." The judge's expression remained stern. "Do you have any evidence beyond your word, Mrs. Creed?" Just then, the courthouse doors burst open. Toby stood in the doorway, chest heaving, his clothes mud-splattered from running. In his hands, he clutched Jonas's war Bible. "Wait," he called out, rushing forward. "Jonas told me once the truth's in this book. He said it's important." The courtroom fell silent as Toby ran down the aisle, his small boots echoing against the floorboards. He held the Bible out like a precious offering, his eyes bright with determination and hope. With trembling fingers, Ashley opened the worn Bible. A yellowed envelope, sealed with wax, fell from inside its leather cover. The courtroom held its breath as she carefully broke the seal. "Your Honor," she began, her voice growing stronger, "this is a letter from Colonel James Morrison, dated 1863. Her eyes widened as she read. It states that he directly ordered Lieutenant Jonas Creed to light signal fires during the Valley campaign, despite the high winds. The colonel accepts full responsibility for the tragic spread of those flames. Jonas lifted his head, shock written across his weathered face. Ashley continued reading, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room. Lieutenant Creed protested the order, warning of the danger. "The civilian deaths rest solely on my command, not his conscience. I carry that burden to my grave." The judge removed his spectacles, wiping them slowly. "In light of this evidence, all charges are dismissed. Mrs. Creed's water rights remain her own." He nodded to Sheriff Doolin, who stepped forward to unlock Jonas's shackles. Caden's face reddened as he stormed toward the door, Mr. Halley close behind. Around them, townspeople murmured apologies, heads bowed in shame. Jonas knelt beside Ashley's chair, his voice rough with emotion. "I never deserved your faith in me." Ashley touched his cheek gently, her eyes bright with tears. "None of us deserve grace," she whispered. "We're given it." The evening sun painted long shadows across the mountain trail as Jonas and Ashley rode home together. Their horses' hooves kicked up dust that glowed like gold in the fading light. The familiar sight of their cabin appeared through the trees, smoke curling from the chimney into the dusky sky. "Jonas! Ashley!" Toby's voice rang out across the clearing. He bounded down the path, his face bright with joy, and Jonas swept him up into a tight embrace. Inside, Ashley stirred a pot of venison stew, while the familiar sounds of Jonas's hammer echoed from outside. He worked steadily at the broken shutter, pausing now and then to watch through the window as Ashley and Toby set the table. When he finished, Jonas stepped inside and carefully placed his war Bible back on the shelf above the fireplace. His shoulders relaxed, as if setting down a heavy burden at last. Over bowls of steaming stew, they talked of tomorrow and new beginnings. "We could clear that south patch for a garden," Ashley suggested, "and maybe come spring, we could teach reading and numbers to the children from nearby homesteads." After they said their evening prayers, Jonas walked out onto the porch. The night air carried the sweet scent of pine, and countless stars glittered overhead. Ashley joined him quietly, leaning her head against his shoulder. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The soft mountain wind whispered through the trees, a gentle lullaby for their healing hearts. Weeks passed as spring settled fully into the mountain valley. The morning sun warmed the trail as Jonas guided their wagon down toward Silver Creek, the back loaded with carefully stretched pelts. Ashley sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, while Toby bounced eagerly in the wagon bed, watching the town draw closer. The streets looked different now. Where once there had been whispers and turned backs, townsfolk smiled and waved. Jonas nodded quietly in return, his shoulders no longer tense as they passed the general store. Sheriff Doolin tipped his hat respectfully, and even Mr. Peterson, who'd never spoken to Jonas before, called out a hearty, "Good morning." At the church, Ashley unpacked her slate and books, while children gathered around her makeshift classroom in the corner. Their eyes shone with curiosity as she taught them their letters. Toby moved among the younger ones, helping them trace chalk marks with patient hands. Jonas watched from the doorway for a moment, pride softening his weathered features, before heading to trade his pelts. "Your boy's got a gift for teaching," Mrs. Thompson told Ashley as she collected her children after the lesson. "We're blessed to have your family here." The words, "your family," rang sweet in Ashley's ears as she packed up her supplies. That evening, they rode home under purple-tinged clouds. Jonas was unusually quiet, even for him, lost in thought. After supper, while Ashley mended by candlelight and Toby played with his wooden figures near the hearth, Jonas disappeared into his workshop behind the cabin. The familiar sounds of sawing and sanding filled the cool evening air. When he finally came inside, he carried something wrapped in burlap. Ashley looked up from her sewing as he carefully mounted a beautifully crafted wooden bracket near the window. The piece was lovingly made, with carved leaves trailing down its sides. "What's it for?" Ashley asked, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Jonas placed a lantern in the holder, his movements deliberate. "For anyone wandering lost in the dark," he said softly. His voice carried the weight of memory, of his own darkness, and the light that had found him. The twilight deepened outside their window as he struck a match. The lantern's warm glow filled the cabin and spilled out across the valley below. Ashley stood and moved beside him, placing her hand over his where it rested on the windowsill. "He walked away from his vows," she whispered, thinking of that day in the church that seemed so long ago now. Her voice grew stronger, filled with certainty. "But you walked me into grace." Jonas's fingers tightened gently around hers. Toby came to stand with them, his small hand slipping into Ashley's free one. Without a word, they knelt together beside the window. The lantern's light touched their bowed heads as they prayed, casting a gentle radiance that reached out into the gathering night. A beacon of hope, of forgiveness found, and of love that had grown strong in the shelter of these mountains. The lamp glowed steadily, marking their cabin as a place of welcome, of second chances, and of faith restored. Below in the valley, its light shone like a star fallen to earth, guiding the way home. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.